Hello everyone, my name's Dr. Paul Rose. I am a lecturer in animal behaviour at the University of Exeter, and I am a research associate and the manager of the Animal Welfare and Ethics Committee for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. And it's my great pleasure to be at the EAZA conference virtually to talk to you all about a project that I was involved in that looked at sound and associated impacts on animal behaviour and welfare in the zoo. I'd like to start by thanking the EAZA Animal Welfare Committee and particularly Dr. Holly Farmer for allowing me the opportunity to come and talk about this research that looked at sound measurement and potential effects of changes to the soundscape on behaviours that might indicate changes in animal welfare states, as well as how animals use their space at two different zoological collections in the UK. In this talk, I'd like to give you some hints and tips on how sound measurement could be built into animal welfare assessment protocols and discuss some of the case studies from this project that I was involved in. So why listen to the zoo? We know that we look at the zoo and we like to observe animals, but do we always hear what's going on? Sound influences cross species. It's not just the animals at the zoo that will be influenced and impacted upon by changes to the soundscape. So human engagement and human comfort whilst people are at the zoo, their perception of the zoo as a place that cares for its animals, will be influenced positive or negatively by the sounds that they hear. How we communicate with our visitors and run education programs will also be influenced by sound. For example, informal education of zoo visitors based on requests for them to change their behaviour around sound-sensitive species. So sound and listening is just as important as looking and seeing. So this talk is based on the project that I was involved in that was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council that was entitled Listening to the Zoo. This project ran between 2018 and 2020. It involved data collection at Bristol Zoo and Paignton Zoo, and the PIs for this project were based at the Universities of Exeter and St Andrews. I'm going to give you some examples of the research outputs from this project and give you some snippets from what I learned, particularly around the challenges of sound recording in the zoo and correlating that with animal behaviour that I picked up during my time as a postdoc in this work. Firstly, just a bit of scene setting. Lots of sounds in the zoo come from humans, and anthropogenic sounds can potentially impact on animal welfare states. And we know that there are sounds that occur in the zoo that can influence or correlate with particular animal behaviour patterns, examples of which can be found in the scientific literature. But what's important is the fact that sounds and visitor effects can sometimes be hard to distinguish or can be hard to quantify. We know that visitors respond to animals, and that response often involves sound. Change in tone or spoken voice or excitement might increase the power of the sound environment around the animals that the visitors are interested in. Visitor effects in the zoo are also under the influence of external factors, weather and climate, for example. And these other factors are also being responded to by the animals as well. Both visitors and animals create sounds, which can lead to behavioural change in the animals. The animals might be more active, they might be more likely to be on show, they might be displaying a more diverse array of behaviours. This in turn makes the visitors respond more to the animals, and so the cycle continues. So it's very important that when we measure the sound environment, we also measure the effects of visitors by counting visitor number or visitor density, by attempting to understand the normal or regular behaviour pattern of the animals, individual or population level, that we are interested in, to try and pick out what, if any, behaviour and welfare changes are associated with changes to the sound environment, or what, if any, changes have come from the presence of visitors or the presence of other aspects of zoo husbandry. What I'm going to outline in this talk is a brief case study on sound and effects on enclosure usage, some examples of work that looked at sound and impacts on animal behaviour, some results from a workshop of zoo professionals and how they would consider sound whilst working in the zoo, and then some examples of considerations and recommendations for future studies and how we might build sound measurement into animal welfare assessment protocols in the future. So first off, let's look at how the sound environment may influence the space occupancy of animals within their enclosure. And this work was published in 2021 in Zoo Biology. It used a flock of flamingos at Bristol Zoo and a flock of flamingos at Paignton Zoo. Flamingo flocks at both zoos were situated right at the front of the zoo and were one of, if not the, first exhibit that visitors to the zoo would encounter. Flamingo enclosures were split into biologically relevant zones, and scan sampling was used to record the count of the number of birds in each zone across different times of the day. We measured the effect of visitors by looking at the maximum number of visitors that passed through the enclosure during the observation period, as well as the discrete count of the largest individual group of visitors that was seen in that observation period too. We also measured environmental conditions such as temperature, humidity, and the amount of direct sunlight. What we found were differences between these two flamingo flocks. Differences in how they responded to sound, how they responded to visitors, and how they responded to climate. For the flock of Chilean flamingos at Paignton Zoo, there is the potential for wider enclosure occupancy with increasing sound power. Birds may be more spread out around the enclosure as the sound environment gets louder. However, this relationship was not seen in the greater flamingo flock at Bristol Zoo. In terms of when visitors were present, we saw wider enclosure usage with larger crowds of people at both zoos. However, this might be a factor of time of day and of environmental weather variables as well. So it's really important that we attempt to consider how these different variables may correlate together when we're attempting to understand whether or not changes in enclosure usage are based solely on the sound environment or different factors. For the Chilean flamingos at Paignton Zoo, weather, particularly increases in sunlight, encouraged more usage of the bird's central island, and more increases in cloud cover, so less sunlight, increased usage of the pool. Whereas at Bristol Zoo, there were no environmental influences on enclosure usage. Yes, these are two different species in two different zoos, so we also need to consider that. But my point of showing you this example is there is no clear-cut evidence for sounds influencing one type of bird where it's found in captivity. This seems to be very multifactorial with different variables involved and therefore very population and very location specific. The next part of the project looked at animal behaviour, and this is work that is currently under review. Welfare states are going to be influenced by environmental challenges that animals face, individual coping strategies, which can be behavioural, and the fitness and feelings, the emotional states of the individual animal itself. So this work again looked at bird species at Bristol Zoo and at Paignton Zoo, including the Chilean flamingos and the greater flamingos that I've already mentioned. It also looked at a range of tropical birds in a walk-through enclosure at Bristol Zoo and a range of desert-living birds in another walk-through enclosure at Paignton Zoo. For example, Victoria crown pigeons at Bristol Zoo and elegant crested tinamous at Paignton Zoo. I haven't shown any data for this talk for this part of the talk because these data are currently still under review. But what we did for this project was we recorded behavioural data for focal individuals where relevant, or for the group if there was no individual identification. We measured sound at specific time points or at specific time intervals. And it's very important that if you try and do this, you place your sound recorder in an area of the animal's enclosure where there is no barrier to sound being recorded, and so that the sound recorder is not placed on any materials that might conduct sound and therefore elevate your readings of the sound environment. And if you do wish to do this, it's also important to think about biologically relevant sound measures. And Raven Pro, which is what I used for my sound analysis, has an excellent set of guidelines to help you. For example, some of the measurements that I used included inbound power, which gave you an idea of the change in the power of the sound environment at particular points. Or you could also measure LEQ, which is the average change in the power of the sound environment across a specified time period. We looked at scan samples and focal follows, and we correlated the animal's behaviour at particular time intervals with prevailing characteristics of the sound environment, i.e. the power or frequency of the sound, at that same time interval as calculated by Raven Pro. And I'm happy to talk to people if they'd like to know more about this in the future. My email address was on the front of this presentation. Alongside of the animal behaviour and animal enclosure usage studies, this project also looked at people. And this photo is the PI of the project, Dr. Tom Rice from the University of Exeter, recording ambient sound to look at what human visitors to the zoo might be experiencing. If you would like to know more about the methodologies that attempted to understand changes in human interactions with the sound environment, changes in perception of the zoo and its animals that are associated with sound, some of this work has already been published, and I've provided the references on this slide. If you'd like to know more about how guided walks and semi-structured and structured interviews took place to ask people about the experiences of the sound environment, all of the methods are detailed in these papers. But one of the things that I would just like to talk about briefly is a workshop that I was involved in at the end of this project, where stakeholders from both zoos, from other zoological establishments, as well as zoo membership organisations, scientists, academics, and other relevant stakeholders were all brought together to ask them about their perception of sound at the zoo on animal behaviour and welfare. What do we currently do, and what should we do in the future to promote the beneficial aspects of sound or to mitigate any of the negative aspects of sound on animal behaviour and welfare? And what I have just done on this slide here is split out some of the responses that workshop delegates provided to taxonomic groups that they were given: mammal, bird, reptiles, and fish and invertebrates. So, for example, for mammals in the zoo, workshop delegates believe that we do currently educate our visitors on sound-sensitive species and events. For example, we explain at certain times of the year, maybe when animals are in the breeding season, that they should be quiet around that particular enclosure. But we should collect more evidence on sounds and the biological relevance of these sounds, particularly concerning daily routines and how that might impact on the behaviour and welfare of the mammals that we keep. For birds, delegates considered that we do explain to visitors that they might have impacts on a species by species basis. For example, if we talk to things like parrots, they will make noises back again. Or maybe there are some birds that are more likely to sing if they hear a wider presence of noise from zoo visitors. So this can be explained at the enclosure. However, delegates believe that we should consider sound in welfare assessments, particularly for species that are highly communicative with auditory forms of communication, and particularly those with wide-ranging vocal behaviours. Is sound an indication of stress and potential impacts on animal welfare? This is something that needs more work. For reptiles and amphibians, there was considered to be thorough and consistent visitor education on the effects of noise on welfare. For example, please don't bang on vivarium glass. But delegates realised or considered that there was very little information out there on enclosure design and soundproofing, and how we should attempt to build more soundproofing in enclosure design for reptiles in the future. Especially because many reptile and amphibian houses, because they are indoors, can channel sound and potentially amplify it around the animals. And finally, for fish and invertebrates, we perhaps consider assessment of husbandry around responses to sound, i.e., for example, around life support equipment. We are aware that filtration systems, for example, make noise. But we should think about validating behavioural measures of welfare where we can see responses of the animal to sound to provide a quick and on-the-spot means of animal welfare assessment, especially if we are seeing potential negative behavioural responses to changes in the sound environment. For example, fish that are suddenly darting away from sound, or invertebrates that are not being on show because they're hiding away from busy periods of visitation. So a range of future research questions that others could potentially think about answering that include sound as one of the assessment tools when we look at animal welfare states. So to finish, I'd just like to provide you with some future thoughts and ideas on where this project could go. We could build in consideration of sound into husbandry guidelines and enclosure design plans. We could do more literature searching to try and understand the auditory range of the species that we care for. It's very important that our perception of what sound is as humans can differ from what many of our zoo species can understand and perceive. So consideration of what species can hear and therefore the impacts of sound on their behaviour is incredibly important. So what I have done here is just provide an example in blue of what we might want to put into husbandry guides in the future. It is important to reflect on the modes of communication employed by a species and how this may be influenced by the sounds within and around the enclosure. Consider a species' responses to and processing of auditory information when designing and locating exhibits and implementing husbandry. Statements like this, included in relevant or up-to-date husbandry guides, can cause pause and reflection of those providing care, and then opportunities for evaluation of that care alongside of the sound environment to potentially mitigate negative aspects of the sound environment, or to go and research any effects of the sound environment, then change the husbandry standard so that the husbandry document is continually evolving alongside of our understanding of species responses to sound. For those of you that would like to go and do this in the future, a couple of helpful points for welfare assessment that include sound could be thinking about human perception compared to what the animal hears. How do we actually know what they know what is going on? Can they perceive the sounds that we are recording in the same way? And does the sound have the same meaning? Placement and calibration of recording equipment is very important. In this photograph, you can see my sound recorder with the sound baffle on the top to reduce the effects of noise from wind, for example, on the quality of sound recording, placed high above any other features of the enclosure that might conduct sound unnaturally into the sound recorder. Think about the concept of noise. Noise is a human creation. Noise are sounds that we don't like to hear. But noise is potentially meaningless to animals. We should think about the biological or ecological relevance of the measurement of the sound environment and consider moving away from saying noises, because that is a very much human construct. And we could think about sound wave frequency and pressures, as well as distances from the animal to the sound and how we correlate behavioural responses. This is quite tough to do because obviously sound will dissipate in its power the further you are away from it. So sounds that might be very obvious to the recorder might be less obvious to the animals in the middle of their enclosure. Guidelines on the best way to record sound in and around animal enclosures would be something that could be very useful for researchers in the future, if these were documents that the zoo community could collaborate on and bring together to help future sound measurement. It's important that we want to think about auditory ranges, baseline data on what animals can and cannot hear, and how they can hear into parts of the auditory spectrum that we cannot perceive would be very helpful. We also need to think about species that don't just hear with their ears. For example, fish that perceive changes in sound pressure through their lateral lines. Are we capturing their responses to the sound environment with our welfare assessment tools? We need to think more about the impacts of life support systems on sound, habituation and learned helplessness, maybe by looking at lethargy or inactivity. And if animals are not responding to sounds as they change, that might indicate changes to animal welfare states and potential poor welfare. We should consider the placement and location of life support systems within animal environments. For example, noisy filtration systems. See, I've said the word noisy there, but we're so used to doing that as humans, but I'm going to go with it. Noisy filtration systems in fish tanks, which might be negatively impacting on how animals communicate or use the space within the environment that has been created. And we also need to think about the relevance of sound to visitor messaging. How do we direct and instruct a visitor behaviour based on asking them to change their behaviour and to change the sounds that they make whilst they're in or around particular species of animal? We also have peaks and troughs in sounds at different times of the day, and therefore further study needs to consider this based on the normal circadian rhythm and time activity budget of the species that's being investigated. Don't assume that just because we perceive the zoo to be a very busy place with very much power in the sound environment, that the animal might be responding or perceiving that in the same way. I hope this presentation has been useful to explain the complexities of sound to animal welfare assessment and measurement. Do please get in touch if you would like any more information and any more detail on any of the aspects of this project that I have been involved in and that I have explained to you in this talk. And if you can't get hold of any of the papers that I've mentioned, do let me know and I'm happy to send them over. Thank you very much, and please do enjoy the rest of your conference.